Hello, it's the 15th of February 2018 in New Zealand, and today I want to talk about the truths about these two words, natural birth. It's been so interesting since I became aware of the childbirth conversation, and I have to say that occurred when I got pregnant and gave birth for the first time in 1970. It was sort of a term used, and I'll sort of explain that in this conversation. But when we think of it, there are only two words, birth, and most of us can agree what that means. That for most of us, birth means the end of pregnancy. So pregnancy naturally ends with giving birth. But what's the word natural mean? How do we use the word natural when we tie it to the word birth? As I grew up and then the generations before this became a special term, so to speak, natural birth would have been considered any birth. It would have been natural that women give birth. There wasn't a lot of medical care prior to the Second World War. Anything that happened at a birth was considered natural and normal, even though it may have been infrequent and unwanted and a poor outcome. So the word natural, when it was connected to the word birth, meant that all births were natural. They occurred. Women could cope with birth, and there was a natural occurring pain. Some women didn't cope with the natural occurring pain, and it was considered normal and natural for women to either cope or not to cope with the natural occurring pain. So you see, the word already gets confusing. It was considered normal for a woman to feel out of control. It was considered to be normal for a woman to feel she had an easy birth. It was considered normal for a baby to be born head down. It was considered normal for a baby to be born breech. It was considered normal for a baby to be posterior. It was considered normal for there to be a healthy baby or one that had problems. It was considered normal for women to recover easily or not. So we used the word normal and natural. We didn't really tie those words together as they have become since the 1980s. And that change occurred in my lifetime between my first birth and my last birth. My first birth was in 1970. My last birth was in 1982. And by 1982, those terms got linked to mean a specific thing. And I've talked about this in other of the talks. When I gave birth in 1970 in the United States, and I don't know what happened in other countries except New Zealand where I live now. So what happened in the United States happened in New Zealand from the 50s to the 70s, and in the United States from the 60s through the 70s. And that was a societal expectation in the United States that everybody become skilled via Lamaze or the Bradley method, because that was the first childbirth preparation. In New Zealand, it wasn't everybody that became skilled. Grantley Dick Reed's method, he was another male obstetrician who had developed a method of breathing and relaxation, which is now known as childbirth without fear. His system was first adapted in New Zealand. And women who wanted to take those classes actually had to be recommended by a doctor. It was like a treatment. And so they had to have a prescription to attend those classes, whereas in the United States, everybody attended the classes. Yet there was a caveat to those classes. It was more clearly defined in New Zealand, because to get a prescription to have a treatment, it was for those women who were literally and could verbally define that they wanted a birth without medical care. So they considered then a natural birth to be one that didn't have medical care attached to it. And they also wanted a pain-free labor, because it was considered by Grantley Dick Reed to be natural that women didn't have pain in labor, and that they could achieve that naturally by breathing and relaxation techniques. Lamaze and Bradley, two other male obstetricians, pretty much felt the same way. So their system in the United States, and Lamaze was definitely the more popular, and the Bradley method was called the husband-coach childbirth, because fathers were just permitted into the birth, whereas in New Zealand you had a trained birth coach, and Lamaze was definitely related to fathers being the birth coach, and he defined it as a birth coach. And those two systems also, even though they were taught in the Lamaze, in the hospital, to everybody, women were told these skills will not work if you are induced. These skills don't work if. They work for natural birth. So then the term meant they work for natural birth. So what did that term then mean? Well, they said if you were induced, you weren't having a natural birth. At that time, when you were induced, they didn't have the sophistication of induction as they do now. So you were given a shot in your leg. They didn't even do it through IVs, and your uterus became very excited. And induced labors back in the 70s meant a huge, dramatic change in what the birth was doing. The reason that the medical profession changed how they did that was that women who were induced, their babies were more likely to have difficulty because the uterus became hypertonic and hyperactive. But the implication that once you were induced, or once you had medical care, your birth was no longer natural, meant that many women who had learned Lamaze or Bradley stopped using the skills. And this, as I've said before, is the original sin in childbirth, and it has had profound, far-reaching, generational, unintended negative consequences. Had these three male obstetricians just said, giving birth is the natural activity that women do at the end of pregnancy, no matter how they give birth, that is naturally how we end pregnancy, is to give birth some way, somewhere, with people present, whether a cesarean or not. As long as you're awake, as long as you're conscious, this is an activity that you are doing. It's a time-filled activity. You have to spend time doing this. So you can fill your time naturally with skills, normally with skills, if only you had been told. And we weren't told. We were told that skills were only connected to having a birth that didn't have medical care around it. And this has been a huge mistake. So when we think about natural birth, we have to stop relating natural birth to something that doesn't have medical care. Now, I know this is going to frazzle the brains of natural birth advocates, because natural birth advocates honestly do not believe that if you give birth in the hospital, that you can have a natural birth that can only occur at home. But why do we say that to one another? And this is a women's issue, and it's the side of women that's mean, and we have to stop it. If you give birth in the hospital, your birth is going to go on no matter what. You can have tubes coming out of every one of your holes. You can have every single medical assessment, monitoring, and procedure. And any woman who has had that realizes that the birth just keeps going on. It just keeps going on. It can be altered, it can be slowed or hastened. It just keeps going on. So birth just naturally keeps going on. But we do have to extend our heart, our empathy, our consciousness, our thoughtfulness to all of us that are having either elective cesareans because we want them, because we need them and would prefer not, or because we're pressured and really didn't want one. We are naturally giving birth to our baby. Yes, it may be a surgical birth, and it may not include the labor part, but it is still the activity that we're doing to birth our baby, which means that in pregnancy, our body is still preparing to labor and have a natural birth because our body doesn't know we're having a cesarean. Our mind knows. So our body is normally and naturally preparing to do the same thing that a woman does who then labors and has a vaginal birth. So it's important that we understand that we can learn skills in that pregnancy period, that that's a normal thing to do. It's natural perceptually to want to learn skills because it's natural for women to want to feel in control. And pregnancy is a time where we don't feel in control, a lot of it. And that's natural and normal because we're raising another human being inside us and we're sharing our body with another human being. And that alters us. And that's a normal and natural part of this gift that women have in our gender, in our species. So when we think about natural birth, we have to just think about all birth. And the reality is we need to just stop using that word. We have to just talk about birth or childbirth or giving birth, which I always think is just the weakest term there is. What kind of a verb is giving? It's as though you're going to give somebody something. But in fact, you have to do it. And if we were using the term doing birth, then more women would be saying, what is it that I have to learn in order to do this birth the best I can possibly do? And that's where skills come in. So if we go back to that period of time where the first universal skills were public and taught to millions of people, particularly in the United States, for a 20-year period, then we have to go back and say, we have to correct that initial failure. Instead of tying those skills to a birth without medical care, because what do we know about births without medical care? I know I've lived in third world countries a great deal of my life. I wasn't involved in birth, but I did teach birthing better skills in villages all around countries where I lived. And where there is no medical care, it is normal and natural for there to be poor outcomes as well as good outcomes. And so when we tie natural birth to the rest of the world where there is no medical care, they use the term appropriately, which is anything and everything about birth is normal and natural, whether it's a good outcome or a poor outcome, whether women cope well or not cope well. So when we think now about childbirth, we have to now say it is natural and normal for you, your friends, your generation of women and men to become skilled to birth our baby, because we have to fill the time it takes to birth our baby doing something, not giving something. We're doing a birth. We're not giving a what? What does that mean, giving birth? So we are doing birth. Now, we're not going to change the English language. We're never going to stop saying giving birth. We will say, I labored, but people now treat labor not as hard work because most of us aren't doing hard work anymore. In third world countries where people are still growing their own food, making their own homes, making their own clothes, walking for miles for water, They are always working hard. And when it comes to birth, they work hard giving birth. And they do it as part of life. They accept that hard work, that harder work, as a normal and natural part of life. Do they feel they suffer? Because that was a term that you heard a lot in the 60s and 70s, that the medical profession could prevent the suffering of childbirth. It didn't mean that they could always prevent problems. They were talking about women who couldn't normally and naturally cope with the normal and natural pain of labor contractions. So you see, we use these two words, often interchangeably, and we use them in a confusing way. So what we're trying to do as a charitable trust is to tell the truth about childbirth. We are doing the activity of giving birth, and we should normally and naturally have an expectation of ourselves and within our society that all women, mothers-to-be and fathers-to-be, become skilled to do the activity of birthing their baby, no matter where they birth, who's present, or what happens at that birth, that it is a normal and natural function of our humanity to be highly skilled to do the activity of birthing our baby, even if that means using skills on the way to the hospital while being prepped and during the surgery, even if that means we labor and then are prepped and then have surgery, even if that means we labor and have a vaginal birth, no matter where we do it or what happens. The reality is when we are induced, the birth still goes on. If we have an augmentation, if the labor is speeded up, it theoretically is speeded up. We have no idea. We can't replay it. But if it gets more intense, even though it's a drug-induced intensity, the birth still goes on. It still goes on. So we have to now tell the truth about the word or the phrase natural birth and realize all of us are giving birth. And we're all doing the hard work of doing it because we're moving from pregnancy to becoming mothers and fathers. So how can you help our charitable trust grow skilled birthing families around the world? You can donate through PayPal at info@birthingbetter.com. You can share this video, comment on it, ask questions about it. You can even argue with us about the term normal birth. But we do want to tell you that we have to stop as women making our births better at the cost of someone else's birth not being good. The birth of every child in every family is equally as important. And as women, we have to stop looking at our children from the way that their birth unfolded. We have to stop saying, she was a cesarean, he was my home birth. We have to stop this. The birth of every child is valued and important. And we birth our babies best when we use skills to do that. This will be on a playlist in YouTube under our YouTube channel, Birthing Better Childbirth Preparation. And we invite you to purchase the resources because they were all developed by people like you, your partner, like me way back then in the 1970s when we developed them. And what do we naturally and normally do? We share the same human body, and that has not changed. So when I talk to you now, I am talking to your generation, and that is the continuation of our humanity. So see you tomorrow.